Hello, my name is Ryan Oto, and I am here to talk with you about an article I recently published in Theory and Research in Social Education, an article titled This is for Us, Not Them, Troubling Adultism Through a Pedagogy of Solidarity in Youth Organizing and Activism. I situate my study in the concept of democratic life in schools. It is an ideal that dates back to John Dewey, where schools can serve as spaces that support and instill the values of democracy in young people to then go on and sustain a thriving democratic society. Social studies scholars have taken this up in a number of really meaningful ways. Um, and through these, we see then these kind of generative conversations about how classrooms can be sites of democratic education, how student organizations in schools like student governments or activities like Model UN or experiential learning like service learning reflect and share these democratic values as well. While these aspirational goals are being met in these ways, one of the things that this also highlights is how democratic education in school contexts is often contingent on adult mediation of youth experiences. And what this does is it perpetuates a notion that democratic life in schools is contingent on adults' willingness to go along with what young people say or want. And we know from other research that race and class exacerbate these contingent forms of civic life in schools. So students of color are disproportionately disciplined compared to their white peers. So they simply just are in school less as a result of that, denying them opportunities to engage in the democratic experiences of school that adults are mediating. Likewise, students that attend Title I schools where families qualify for free and reduced lunch programs um, don't have as many resources to go on field trips or enjoy the types of activities that their more affluent peers do in other schools. Nevertheless, schools remain important sites of civic life for youth. And so my guiding question for this study was, how can adults act in solidarity with youth activists to support and sustain democratic life? Before sharing more about the study itself and the stories that I learned from young people as organizers and activists, I wanted to first kind of share what existing research says about youth and adult relationships in schools. So when I looked at this, the existing scholarship calls these relationships youth adult partnerships. And so youth adult partnerships, think of like a student council where it can be still a ground up space where the issues that young people care about are still central. And that can lead to shared decision making because an adult or a set of adults are still present in that space. The limitation of youth adult partnerships is that they can still be adult led. So adults are still the ones that are making the agendas. They're still the ones kind of explaining what can and can't be done, despite what young people may be advocating for or saying that they need. This then perpetuates adultism, which is that existing power relationship between adults and youth, where youth are subservient to adults in school contexts. As consequently, then conflict resolution defers to adult perspectives. There is this concept that scholars coined called managerialist subterfuge, where ideas or solutions to problems that can be developed in youth adult partnership spaces, adults can actually steer young people away from their ideas because it is politically disadvantageous or they think that they already kind of have tried those things. So you'll often hear adults say, well, what about this? Or have you tried this? Or that won't work. Maybe you should do this instead. And to be clear, in youth adult partnerships, one of the reasons why those things can happen is because the adults who are in these positions are oftentimes in politically very vulnerable positions, because they are oftentimes put in situations where they have to choose between their relationships to the school, which is their employer, their colleagues, other adults, or the young people that they're working with. The other form of youth adult partnership is youth mediated spaces, which are much more youth driven and youth led. Adults oftentimes operate on the periphery of these spaces. They're present, they can be invited, they can offer their perspectives on issues, but decision making and power in the room is really driven by young people. Um, the conflict resolution and the decision making processes as a result are slower because these tend to just be more participatory spaces. And they are also much more tentative in school spaces. They're harder to maintain because the political will of adults and youth has to just be a lot higher to take on the kind of the power dynamics within the institutions themselves. So, to make sense of the ways that adults act in partnership with youth, I chose to use the concept of solidarity. I specifically draw on this concept called a pedagogy of solidarity by Ruben Gatzambide Fernandez. In this conceptualization, he poses three modes of solidarity. And here, what you're seeing are kind of questions that I think uh, exemplify that mode of solidarity. So there's relational solidarity, which is about the relationships that we form with other people, but it's more about how an individual changes because of that relationship. The second one, the transitive solidarity, that is oftentimes what people think of solidarity as a verb. It's what actions are we taking to demonstrate our solidarity because of those relationships that we have. And the third one, the creative solidarity, is once we have relational and transitive solidarity, in what ways do the outcomes of what we're trying to do center solidarity, which tend to just be much more creative, arts based, collective, things like that. So, drawing on the framework of a pedagogy of solidarity and trying to understand the relationships between adults who want to support young people in their democratic lives and schools, I framed this study methodologically within critical ethnography. I was a teacher in the school for 3 years prior to the event that precipitated this study. And so I had been working with the young people that are a part of these stories as a teacher and previously also as youth researchers, as I was also building out a youth participatory action research program in the school. Um, One of the important things to note is that in doing scholarly work with youth, there's an ethical consideration about what stories I can share versus what stories I should share. And so I deferred to young people to help me make sense of what stories they thought were important to share with an audience of adults that are scholars, educators, teacher educators. And so they became really ingrained in the methods work that I was doing and the stories that I was building out. A bit of context about the community. So, Racial Justice Community School is a Title I school. Um, it is a majority minority serving institution. And it's in this community that I use the pseudonym Blueston. It neighbors Minneapolis. And the event happened in the spring of 2021. And there's a couple quick notes that I need to make about that so that the rest of this makes a little more sense. First, that in the spring of 2021, this was when Racial Justice Community School started to make moves away from fully remote learning during the pandemic to hybrid learning. And so this was the first time in a year and a half that many of those students had been together again since the pandemic began and the lockdowns began. Second was that this was also the time that Derek Chauvin, the murderer of George Floyd, his criminal trial was set to begin. And so national media and protests were descending upon kind of the heart of Minneapolis, um, which then kind of leads into this third point, which was that in the weeks leading up to that trial in Blueston, a young black man was pulled over by police officers and killed at a traffic stop. In that, then, the national media, protesters descended on the Blueston police precinct, which was also directly across the street from Racial Justice Community School. And um, the police asked the governor to support the police precinct by calling up the National Guard, which they did. And the school administrators felt that they didn't really have a choice, that it wasn't really safe for students to walk to school or be in school at that moment. So they went back to fully remote learning for 2 weeks. In that moment, these students felt deeply displaced. They had just had an opportunity to come back to school, and suddenly it was taken away from them in a moment. And there was a lot of emotional responses to that. And as I was checking in on a number of the young folks that I was working really closely with, they felt a strong urge to do something. And so the story that I tell in this article is of that protest to a point, that they chose to organize. But it's actually more about the ways in which adults acted in support of these young people and let young people actually lead the organizing and the justice movements. So when we first came together, and for example, myself, another teacher, and another adult co-conspirator um, posed the question, what do you want to do? Within hours, these young people had devised an entire program that involved a protest for racial justice, involved artwork as a form of racial healing, and grounding in restorative justice circles with their peers. One of the challenges that they worried about was the lack of support they felt like they might get from adults. And so we were really strategic about letting them tell us as adults what they felt like they needed, and then we worked on the other sides of our kind of positional authority to ensure that the work they wanted to do was done in the way they wanted it to. And so these forms of solidarity are really what I talk about in the article. Ranging from the relational solidarity of those folks in that first organizing meeting, and how we all really showed up, and it changed the ways that we thought about our identities as teachers in the community in those moments, to the transitive forms of solidarity where, for example, the principal who knew what we were doing was making sure that we had space in the school that was appropriate given what we knew about COVID restrictions, and also big enough for all of the work that they wanted to do. So he was connecting with lunch staff to make sure that students had food, that we could have the cafeteria spaces, things like that. But also that when there was a group of teachers that were asked to show up to the protest, these were people seen as sort of like that the youth organizers had identified as allies, that they actually showed up and they participated. There was also a manager of a local pizza restaurant who heard about the student protest from one of the youth workers in his restaurant, and he decided to give away a bunch of free pizzas on the day of the protest so that these organizers and these young people who were out protesting had free food to eat. And so there was this sense that adults understood what was going on in this really meaningful way, and that they were acting in accordance with the leadership of these young folks. And then there was these forms of creative solidarity that were really grounded in racial justice and racial healing, ranging from the mural that you're seeing here on this slide, as well as the protest signs, the chants themselves that they were using during the protest, and that they also grounded their work in healing and a sense of community. One of the big things that these young folks did was say that this was for them and that they needed to come together. Unfortunately, not all adults shared this sense of solidarity with young people. And the protest ended when a district office administrator shared with the superintendent that students were swearing on uh, uh, on national TV, and they a number of other district administrators then descended onto the protest site, broke it up, and said this wasn't how we were going to act. This was really inappropriate. As a quick caveat, had they talked to any of the youth organizers that were present, they would have heard that the national media correspondents who were there had let the youth protesters know that any swearing couldn't be aired on live TV because of their own policies. So what we saw and what these young people felt was this deep sense of dissonance between the adults who supported them and showed solidarity with them, as well as against these adults who would use language about belonging and connection and care and community, that were coming to disrupt this event that they had organized. Uh, there was a bittersweet taste in the aftermath of that because they had learned a really important political lesson, which was that, as one of the young people said, they would have to rely on themselves if they wanted to change this school, which is what they did. And so, in the aftermath of that protest, two really interesting things happened. One was many of those youth organizers who I was working with as youth researchers framed their research project in the spring around student emotional well-being in the context of racial violence. What they found from doing a broad survey where they received over 600 responses was that their peers felt like adults were exacerbating emotional stress in the day, and they advocated for then a student-centered emotional wellness space. They wrote a grant in support with the district's wellness coordinator to get almost $10,000 to open this space called the Purple Room. And that's what you're seeing here on this flyer. That was a student-led healing space where young people could come, check in, they could do whatever they needed to do emotionally to take care of themselves in the privacy of the space that they needed, and then they could go back to class if that was when they were ready. The second thing that happened was the next year. One of the friends of the organizers and who was also there for the protest founded the school's first ever Black student union, and that group organized the school's first ever college trip to historically Black colleges and universities during spring break. They raised enough funds for every student to go for free, through local organizations, through their own kind of charitable donations from friends and family. And here you're seeing a picture of them at Howard University in Washington, D.C. So there are four takeaways that I want to share with you from this work and from these stories. One is that solidarity with youth cultivates generative forms of democratic life. The work that was taking shape wasn't just replicating forms of democracy that happen outside of school. It was generating forms of democratic life that were grounded in racial justice and healing. Two is that these coalitions of youth and adults can sustain work that improves communities when it's situated in solidarity. And so when we were taking the lead of young people, they understood that we trusted them, and subsequently they felt like they could do more, and there was a greater sense of confidence around their labor, so that when they wanted to have a Black student union, when they wanted to go on these college trips, when they wanted student-led um, healing spaces, that they weren't just going to be turned away right away. And so that shared sense of responsibility and of navigating conflict and problem solving really became true and allowed us to change our community for the better. The third, and this is more for social studies scholarship, but also social studies teaching, youth action is democratic action and education. And what I mean by that is that the things that these young people did, ranging from organizing, practicing leadership skills, advocating and getting people to turn out for the protest, making sure that people were cared for, making sure that people were safe. These are forms of democratic life, and as a result, have political lessons that these young people are taking with them for the rest of their lives. And lastly, adults have a responsibility to act in solidarity with youth. What that means is that we as adults have to take seriously our responsibilities to divest from adultism and these asymmetries of power between young people and ourselves. This doesn't mean that we don't belong at the table of decision making, to be clear. What it means is that we are willing to trust that young people know what they want and what they need. And even if we disagree with that, that we're willing to support them, to allow them to learn lifelong lessons about what it means to be in intergenerational solidarity, to cultivate deep senses of community, and a whole lot more than just what we can learn in a classroom context. Um, Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like access to the article and you don't have it, please reach out. If you have any questions and you'd love to talk a little more, I'm happy to talk with you all. Be well.